Hello and welcome back to my channel, World War II Books Where to Start. I'm your host, Curtis LeMay, and I like to make the rubble bounce. Today we're going to talk about the 5 best World War II books I read this year. I've done a video on the awful list, now I'm going to do a video on the bestest I counted. And one of them's a repeat, but I take no shame in that. It's so good I had to include it in my best of. And I've only got one fiction title, but it's a whopper. It's really outstanding. So these are the best of the best that I ran across this year. I think I read like total about 42 books, and we're going to say 75% of them are probably World War II. Without doing an actual count right now, I'm going to guesstimate 75%. Like most years, 60-75% of my reading is World War II. So if you got a Christmas giving list and you want to know something for that person in your house that is interested in World War II and drives you nuts about it and makes you watch old documentaries about it all the time, and you want to give them a book but you're not sure where to start, well, I got some good ideas here for you. And I'm going to kick it off with Indianapolis by Lynn Vincent and Sarah Vladeck. This was published in 2018, 448 pages of main body text. This is going to recount the tragedy, the last tragedy for the Americans of the war in the Pacific, sinking of the cruiser Indianapolis on its way to rejoin the fleet off of Okinawa in late 45, June 45. They do a really good job. I've read a couple books on Indianapolis, and this has the benefit of being recently published, so they got access to all the archives, and families opening up with the diaries and memories of what their fathers said about the experience, as well as the Navy finally coughing up some material on it, and they've got the transcripts from the court-martial of the commander of the Indianapolis as well to draw on, which is pretty good source material. I think they divided the task of the writing into the actual sinking survival, and then the other person did the courtroom stuff, because you definitely have a style shift in the middle of the book. So for me, the first half is better than the second half. I've said before, I'm not a big fan of courtroom testimony regurgitated word for word. And there's a lot of it here because of putting McVeigh on trial and the feeling that he was railroaded by the Navy into taking blame, courtesy of Admiral King, the most controversial figure in the Navy. And, the Navy's high standards for commanders of ships and the standard they were held to, short of the old British tradition of hanging a failed ship's commander. They didn't quite do that. In the U.S. style was just disgrace them and utterly and ruin their careers without ever actually making them quit the service. So McVeigh was allowed to finish his 20 years or whatever, and given what they called a gravestone promotion to rear admiral, just before he resigned from the Navy. But his career was ruined when the Indianapolis went down, and of course he couldn't outlive the tragedy himself. He eventually killed himself. But this is a really good recitation of the Indianapolis disaster and all the factors that led into the really lightning quick sinking of the ship. It's a pre-war treaty cruiser with no decent underwater protection. She had no sonar gear. She was sailing with some watertight doors, undogged because of the horrifically bad heat conditions within the ship in the Pacific. The pre-war, there was really no air building style. There's really no air conditioning available to even take the edge off the heat. So it was pretty standard practice if you're in a rear area not to be buttoned up at battle stations all day long. It was just too miserable for the crew to endure. So all these factors led into the quick sinking, and not to mention, not least, that the Japanese commander of the submarine actually knew his job and was competent, and of course the Japanese had the best torpedoes of any service in the war, so they didn't fail. They did their job, and Indianapolis went down right quick. So this is a good, I would dismiss all the stuff from the 60s and 70s. This is one-stop shopping for this particular event, I think. And Indianapolis by Lynn Vincent and Sarah Vladeck. That's number 5. Next up is A Beast. I got some bad glare on this one. Okay, sort of. Tower of Skulls by Richard Frank. The History of the Asia-Pacific War. This is going to be a trilogy. This is part 1, just July 37 to 42. And published pretty recently, 2020, 527 pages. And actually, I thought it was going to be longer than that, considering it goes from 37 to 42. So if you're wondering why it starts at 37 and not with the Pearl Harbor attack, well, it's because China. And it's pretty important stuff, often overlooked by historians and people who like to read about the war itself. Don't know much about what happened in China. It's kind of crucial. It's part part of one of reason one of two of what the Japanese were doing. They wanted China and they needed oil. It was a two-pronged thing. They had to have both for empire. So Richard Frank does not mess around. He's very detailed and an excellent writer. There's a couple chapters that might drag here and there, and you might be unfamiliar with the cast of characters in China, Stilwell and whatnot, and Chiang Kai-shek and the command structure there, and some of the Chinese generals. I certainly was. But overall, he moves along at a pretty brisk pace, considering. He does slow down for a set piece on Pearl Harbor. That's kind of where he really wants to, despite being a general history of the Pacific War, he's going to focus on certain events more than others. He does slow down to give you a wide, deep view of Pearl Harbor, and it's not going to be your traditional bullet-by-bullet account, but it is fascinating for the aspect and direction he takes with it. So that's a good start to the trilogy, and trilogies for Pacific general histories are kind of a thing now. There's 2 or 3 of them out. So this one stands above the others, I think, and recommend it highly. It's number 4. And Richard Frank is going to be with us again here for Downfall, number 3 on my top 5 list. The End of the Imperial Japanese Empire. This dates back to 99, 360 pages. I'm sorry. 360 pages. And I reread this during the summer and found it to be just as good as the first time I read it back in 99. It's a really detailed breakdown of the final agony of the Japanese government's decision to sue for peace, to accept the idea of unconditional surrender, provided the emperor stays, will finally quit. And the agonizing process of people dragging their feet and not wanting to be the first one to say it, but needing to say it, but not saying it in such a way that they get their heads chopped off. Very possibly to be assassinated for your political views in Japan. It was a thing. It was a trend. It was a very, very popular thing to do. Government ministers were assassinated from the 20s onward for their peacenik tendencies or views or open statements. You can be assassinated for any number of reasons by fringe political groups or enemies within your own political group, yada, yada, yada. So Richard Frank's going to take it all through this and the atomic bombings. And a staunch defense of the rationale for the atomic bombings. He makes a really good case that the Japanese simply were not moved to feel that they had lost the war yet. Without an actual physical invasion to really beat them down in their homes, they really didn't feel they were losing. They had convinced themselves that all the other losses of territory and the oil that was one of the primary reasons to go to war, it just didn't matter. So long as the homeland was intact, we're still winning. It's a crazy mindset, but he goes through it with you, and you can kind of see that it's irrational. You can kind of see why they might have stuck to that idea. And he makes a really good case that the invasion was not going to be the walkover initially planned for. That the necessary delay to build up forces and supplies to mount the invasion gave the Japanese plenty of time to move a lot of troops into Kyushu to be ready for the Americans and the British. So no matter what, although the million-man casualty figure was probably an exaggeration post-war of what was really projected, it was going to be a vicious bloodletting. Along with the 7,000 or so aircraft the Japanese had stockpiled for last-ditch kamikaze attacks, which could have been highly effective on their home turf, with radar not being effective close to land masses. It could have been a really bloody ordeal. Take it all through that, and then he discusses the alternative of starvation by blockade and how that wasn't going to play politically with the U.S. electorate. And it might have been better, in one sense, to drop the bombs instead of starving millions more to death in the fall of 45. This might have been more expedient and maybe a little bit more merciful to drop the bombs than to starve people to death. Now, it might be a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow, but again, I think he makes a convincing argument that this was, the atomic bombs were not a throwaway gesture at the Soviets, warning them off, as has been politicized through the decades. It really was a genuine military method to get them to surrender. So that's Downfall by Richard Frank. I recommend this one highly. If you have any interest in the end of the war and reasons for why we dropped the bombs, there you go. And then switching gears a little bit to my number 2, Anzio by Lloyd Clark. Italy and the Battle for Rome, 44. So this is a brief one at 331 pages from '06. And I like this for its brevity and its clarity and its directness, with a lot of the battlefield, nasty little stories in there, and all the grit and grime that you want from, trenches, a few feet apart, and all little probing attacks, and sneaking behind the lines, tanks deployed poorly, artillery being the queen of the battlefield for real here, and all the Allied blundering for decision making. It's all here, and it's Carlo D'Este did a really good book on Anzio too, but it's quite bloated, and D'Este is a really thick military historian style-wise. He can really bog down, whereas Lloyd Clark breezes through this really well. Keeps you going. Snap pop, no lack of action here. It presents the order of battle really well, really clearly. Just because there are a lot of different forces involved: British, Canadian, Americans, excuse me, Germans. So that for that sake, it's done really, really clearly. So I highly recommend Anzio. And the Italian theater gets ignored a lot. I think this is a good one to get you into it. And my number 1, the only novel on the list this year, the only standout, really, and that's Cruel Sea by Nicholas Monsret. Published in '51, 510 pages. And if you've watched anything on my channel, you know I have a weakness for U-boats and the U-boat war, and this is really good. This is an English sea yarn. Nicholas Monsret did serve during the war. He was in the Royal Navy, and he was on the Corvette, so he's got a lot of experience here to lend to the fiction writing, and it's done excellently. This is, I'm a sucker for sea yarns too, and you throw in a U-boat and a destroyer or a Corvette battling the U-boat packs, you hook me instantly. Not to mention that story just really grabs you, makes you sit down and pay attention. And it's bitter. These people the Royal Navy had bitter experiences. They were fighting a tough war in awful climatic conditions, storms all the time, absolutely wretched weather for 4.5 straight years. And he relates it all the crazy way these corvettes bobbed and shook and shivered on the oceans and didn't sink. He's got a wealth of stories to tell you about that, and it's excellent. There are some really creepy moments in here too, where wow, it really conveys it perfectly. And the ending, the British were just happy to have survived, but they were not elated like Americans were to have won the war. It was simply a relief to have it over and done with. And the final chapter reflects the war weariness, and I have to go on living, and I don't know what's going to be tomorrow, but at least this day was okay. That's how they felt at the end of it. Just a long marathon, slogging through to the end, and they made it, but there was no sense of elation about it. So this novel reflects it all, in style and tone and substance. It's just excellent. The Cruel Sea, and there was a movie made of it too. I haven't had a chance to get hold of it to watch and see how that holds up against it. There are 1,000 different iterations of this novel that's been published and republished. And of course here we have the classic grim cover art of a convoy being attacked at night, done in oil painting. So that's my top 5 for 2022. Bestest. Check my top 5 worst books of 22 also for a comparison and what to avoid. So this is World War II Books Where I Start. I'm your host, whoever I said was at the beginning. I can't remember now. Happy reading, and we'll see you again next year.